church member, the church member who's not truly a Christian but moral and goes to church, looks at them and says, fanatic. They're fanatic. And it's simply because they can't understand. So Christ is able to drink deeply of all this joy because He's a perfect likeness of the Father. Perfectly holy. We must be transformed. Even though as Christians we have been regenerated, and it enables us to drink something of the joys of God, we do not drink all the joys of God. Why is that? Because of our flesh, which is misled and misguided and will desire other things. But one day that in itself will be redeemed and we'll be able to enjoy God fully. That should be your hope, that one day even this flesh of mine shall be redeemed in the resurrection, in the flesh. I shall stand before God and drink deeply of Him without one distraction. Folks, for me, the greatest thing about heaven is this. I will no longer sin, and I will no longer be distracted by foolish things, but my eyes will be fixed upon God. It's absolutely amazing. And that's why Christ could drink so deeply of God. Now, let's look at some things here written by a group of different authors about the Son's joy in the Father's presence. Charles Spurgeon writes, Christ being raised from the dead ascended into glory to dwell in constant nearness to God where joy is at its full forever. Okay? Where is joy at its full forever? In the nearness to God. That's why I always say in Isaiah 6, when Isaiah comes into the throne room and you see these seraphim, I believe that you can rightly discern that they are the greatest and most holy of all creatures. The most privileged and most blessed of all creatures among angels. Why? Because of their proximity to the throne of God. Now, the foresight of this urged him onward in his glorious but grievous toil. This is what kept him on the path. The foresight of this urged him onward. Now, let me ask you a question. And this is going to be a lot tougher than you think. What urges you onward in following Christ? I think for most people, that doesn't really enter into their head. They're propelled by a power, the Holy Spirit, but consciously. Very few people are being propelled and pushed on by this idea, this foresight of what lies ahead for them. And I think we're missing out on a lot of strength and power in the Christian life because of this. This should constantly be before your eyes, the prize. The prize. And it should urge you onward and upward. I think many of the times I battle and continue going simply because I just know it's right. Or I think about the consequences of not doing it. The adverse consequences. But it's not foremost in my mind that I'm going upward and onward because of this joy set before me. These promises of glory in the presence of God. Now, notice also Spurgeon says, his glorious but grievous toil. We usually don't associate those two words together, do we? This is glorious. Why? It's a beautiful day. I'm on vacation. Everything's going well. This is glorious. We don't think of glorious and grievous in the same sentence usually. But that's where the glory is. There's very little eternal glory in a beautiful day on vacation. But there is great glory in our struggling with trials because of our desire to advance the kingdom and be conformed to the image of Christ. There's great eternal glory there. Now, Stephen Charnock writes, this is part of the joy of the soul of Christ. He hath now a fullness of joy, a satisfying delight, instead of an overwhelming sorrow. Now, Now I want you to think about something for a moment. You and I know what it's like to live without the presence of God. We knew what it was like prior to our conversion, and then during our conversion, or afterwards, we have different and varying degrees of experiencing the presence of God. Christ, prior to His incarnation, knew nothing but the fullness of the presence of God. This shows us the great trial of His life of 30 years prior to the cross. Do not think, I think it would be wrong to believe, that Christ experienced every moment of those 30 years in the fullness of the Father's presence. I believe it was intermittent. The fellowship was definitely not broke, but you cannot say that in His incarnation He walked around in the fullness of the Father's presence and joy as He did when He sat at His right hand. See, the trial just didn't begin in His 3 years of ministry, folks. His trials always. His suffering began at His incarnation. You and I, it can be commonplace not to sense the presence of God. But for Christ, it was the greatest thing to endure. And then on the cross, even more. Now, so instead of a satisfying delight, His life was marked by overwhelming sorrow. A fullness of joy, not only some sparks and drops as He had now and then in His debased condition, and that in the presence of His Father. His soul is fed and nourished with a perpetual vision of God. What's the food of heaven? The vision of God. While Christ walked on the earth, sporadic experiences of God's presence, sporadic joy in God's presence, but now, seated at the right hand of God, He is fed and nourished with a perpetual vision of God, in whose face He beholds no more frowns, no more designs of threatening Him as a servant, but such smiles that shall give a perpetual succession of joy to Him, and fill His soul with fresh and pure flames. Guys, the things that most douse my flames are sin, the sadness thereof caused by sin, doubt, lack of faith. All those things will be gone. All of them will be completely and forever gone. And we will have a clean, clear vision of God, and it will fan the flames of our heart. Pleasures they are, pleasantness in comparison whereof the greatest joys in this life are anguish and horrors. Now imagine the greatest joy in this life compared to the joy in the next. The greatest in this life is a horror. It is a fear. It is a terrible thing. It is an overwhelming sense of dread compared to the joy that awaits us. His soul hath joys without mixture, pleasures without number, a fullness without want, a constancy without interruption, and a perpetuity without end. Now, even as Christians, we hear such language, and we're drawn off maybe at times to a carnal fulfillment of these things. A carnal fulfillment. Well, we will be able to fly in heaven. What will we look like? Just all these different things. Will we be able to eat everything and not get fat? I mean, there's just so many things that may pop into our head. But you see, what you need to realize is all of that was given to us on earth just as small, tiny, fragmented illustrations of the great joy that would come from Him. God did not have to make us creatures who delight in food. He could sustain us without such. He could have created the world in a different way so that food did not need to be consumed, or either it could be consumed without any delight in it. But He gave us food so that we would delight in the eating of it, only to show us how we will delight in Him. He gave us water to teach us how He would be the source and fountain of everything that could quench us. He gave us marriage only to describe the relationship that He would have with His church, His people. Everything is designed to point us to these future delights, these future graces. Now, I want to read from Jonathan Edwards here. Christ from eternity is, as it were, in the bosom of the Father, as the object of His infinite complacence. In Him is the Father's eternal happiness. Before the world was, He was with the Father in the enjoyment of His infinite love, and had infinite